Across the galaxy, there was a name that sent shivers through the hearts of every civilization. The Zoreth, the ruthless conquerors who had been spreading terror for centuries. Their ships moved like dark shadows across the stars, their warriors relentless in their pursuit of power and domination. They were the embodiment of fear. No one dared stand against them. And those who tried were crushed swiftly and without mercy. The Zoreth were a species born from brutality. Their homeworld, a place of constant warfare, had forged them into a race of conquerors. Their technology was advanced, their tactics flawless, and their thirst for power insatiable. With every world they took, they would leave behind nothing but devastation. Their empire stretched across countless star systems, each one falling without resistance, as the stories of their cruelty spread like wildfire. On the worlds they invaded, entire populations were either destroyed or enslaved. The Zoreth took what they wanted with no regard for the lives they shattered. Their fleets were like storms tearing through the peaceful corners of the galaxy, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. Entire species had been wiped out, and others had fallen into servitude, bound to the Zoreth, will to serve as soldiers or laborers in their new empire. For centuries, the galaxy had whispered about the Zoreth. As they tore through one star system after another, there were no alliances or defenses that could stand against them, no military force powerful enough to challenge their fleets. In fact, most had learned the hard way not to resist when the Zoreth came. They were simply too powerful, too efficient, and too numerous. Even the greatest of empires had crumbled under their might. Civilizations that had once thrived now existed only in ancient histories passed down through the generations as warnings to those who still lived. Their glory had been extinguished like flickers of light in a vast dark abyss. And then one day, after the Zoreth had carved their path of fear and dominance, another whisper began to circulate, one that sent ripples of confusion through their ranks. It was a story from the farthest reaches of known space, a story of a strange new ship, one that was not from any known species, a ship that had entered Zoreth-controlled space and had caused a disturbance in the Zoreth fleet. At first, the rumors were dismissed as nothing more than the fantasies of defeated survivors, but as more reports came in and the strange ship continued to slip through their vast war zones, the Zoreth could no longer ignore it. They sent scouting parties to investigate, only to find that this ship fought with an unexpected ferocity and cunning. It was not like any of the weak species they had encountered in the past. No, it was different. It was something else entirely. The Zoreth General Gorak had spent years ensuring that their empire remained unchallenged. Now, he found himself questioning whether their dominance was truly as secure as he had believed. Something was happening, something that could shake the very foundation of their reign across the galaxy. A force had emerged that was defying their absolute power. And as the Sovereign's wrath, a lone human warship glided through the dark void, it made its intentions known. It would not kneel to the Zoreth. It would not fall like the others. It would challenge the ancient terror the Zoreth had spread across the stars. The Sovereign's wrath was a mystery to the Zoreth, a ship unlike anything they had encountered before. Its sleek, dark hull gleamed under the distant starlight, and its weapons systems pulsed with an unspoken promise of danger. It was small compared to the massive Zoreth warships, but it moved with a deadly precision that suggested it was anything but ordinary. On board the Sovereign's wrath was a crew of humans, an eclectic group from many different walks of life, but united by one common goal: survival. They were led by Captain Emily Carter, a woman whose reputation had spread even before the warship arrived in Zoreth space. Captain Carter was known across the human colonies for her sharp intellect and unyielding determination. In battle, she had fought in countless skirmishes and had earned the trust of her crew through a combination of tactical brilliance and an innate ability to read the battlefield. The crew of the Sovereign's wrath was small but fiercely loyal. Many of them had joined the ship's ranks out of necessity, driven by the need to protect their homes from the advancing Zoreth Empire. But they had also come to admire Carter's leadership. She never ordered them into battle without a plan, and she never sent them into harm's way unless there was a clear chance of victory. They knew that she believed in them, and they trusted her with their lives. When the ship first entered Zoreth space, the crew expected resistance. They had heard the stories about the Zoreth, how their fleets were unstoppable and their warriors ferocious. But there was something about this particular ship that gave them confidence. They knew they were on a mission to stop a tyrant, and that was a cause worth fighting for. Captain Carter knew that the human race could not fight the Zoreth. With sheer numbers, they were outmatched in every way. But that was where humanity's greatest strength lay, in their ability to think outside the box, their adaptability, their ingenuity. Carter had learned in her years of fighting that it wasn't always the biggest army that won, but the one that could outsmart its opponent. The first time they came into contact with a Zoreth scouting party, the humans showed no fear. The Sovereign's wrath had been built for flexibility and speed, not brute force. And as the Zoreth ships closed in, thinking they had trapped the human vessel, they quickly realized they had underestimated their opponent. Captain Carter had ordered a feint retreat, drawing the Zoreth into an asteroid field where the Sovereign's wrath danced between massive rocks. Using the terrain to its advantage, the Zoreth ships struggled to keep up their sensors, unable to track the elusive human ship as it maneuvered through the debris. The Zoreth were puzzled. They had expected the humans to fight in the same predictable way as every other species they had encountered, but instead they were faced with something new, something that made them question their understanding of warfare. Captain Carter had crafted a strategy of deception and agility that bewildered the Zoreth, who were used to dominating their enemies through sheer force. As the battle raged on, the Zoreth found themselves in disarray. Their command ships lost communication, their formations broken as the human ship struck from unexpected angles and disappeared just as quickly. The Zoreth fleet scattered in confusion and retreat as the Sovereign's wrath emerged unscathed. The news of the strange ship spread like wildfire among the Zoreth, and for the first time in decades, the once feared empire began to experience doubt. The humans had done what no one had ever thought possible. They had made the invincible Zoreth retreat, and in doing so they sparked something deeper than just hope. It was the beginning of a resistance across the galaxy. General Gorak could not believe what had just occurred. His forces had been humiliated by a single human vessel, and now it seemed that the galaxy's other civilizations were watching, waiting to see if humanity could continue to defy the Zoreth power. The question was no longer if the Zoreth would conquer the galaxy, but if humanity could turn the tide and make the Zoreth fear them as they had once feared no one. The Sovereign's wrath didn't retreat, didn't cower in the face of overwhelming odds. Instead, it pressed forward into the heart of Zoreth-controlled space. As it cruised deeper into enemy territory, every starship it passed felt the rumble of the approaching storm. It was a quiet threat, its silhouette barely visible against the void. But its message was clear. Humanity would no longer bow to the Zoreth. It was a challenge unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. For weeks, General Gorak had dismissed the human ship as a mere fluke, a single vessel causing a minor disturbance. He had laughed it off, and his officers had reassured him that no human ship, no matter how clever or fast, could stand against the might of the Zoreth fleet. But as more reports filtered in from the farthest reaches of their territory, something began to shift in his gut. The Sovereign's wrath wasn't retreating. It was getting bolder, picking off smaller Zoreth vessels one by one, dismantling military strongholds, and sabotaging key supply lines. This human ship wasn't just a nuisance, it was proving to be a threat. Gorak had finally had enough. He called together his warlords, each one a formidable leader of a vast fleet, and ordered a coordinated strike against the human vessel. This would be no simple encounter. This would be a battle to crush the human menace once and for all. Every Zoreth warship was called in, their massive hulls, armed with devastating weapons, looming like unstoppable juggernauts. As the Zoreth warships prepared for battle, Captain Emily Carter stood at the helm of the Sovereign's wrath, eyes fixed on the star maps. She knew that this wasn't just another skirmish. This would be the first real test of humanity's resolve. She'd studied Zoreth tactics for weeks, and what she saw was a classic overconfidence. The Zoreth relied on sheer firepower, assuming that size and strength would overwhelm any foe. But Carter had no intention of fighting them head-on. She had a different plan. The Sovereign's wrath glided into position on the outer edge of the battlefield, her sensors locked on the approaching Zoreth fleet. Captain Carter issued a quiet command to her crew, and the warship's systems hummed to life, each officer moving with practiced precision. She didn't need to speak much. Her crew knew their roles instinctively. The Zorath were powerful, but they weren't invincible. Carter was counting on one thing the Zorath lacked: flexibility. As the Zorath warships bore down on them, the human ship opened fire, but not with the destructive force the Zorath were expecting. Instead, Carter deployed a barrage of electromagnetic pulses, disabling the Zorath's navigation systems and temporarily blinding their radar. The Zorath fleet, momentarily crippled, stumbled in disarray, their formations falling apart. In the chaos, the Sovereign's wrath darted through the gaps, hitting their enemy with precise, calculated strikes that crippled vital weapon systems and engines. The Zorath warlords were stunned. They had prepared for an enemy that would engage them in a traditional battle, one that relied on strength and numbers. But the humans weren't playing by those rules. The Sovereign's wrath used every advantage of speed, agility, and cunning, slipping in and out of the Zorath's defensive lines like a shadow, never allowing them a chance to retaliate with their full force. The battle wasn't without its casualties. The Sovereign's wrath took hits. Some of the Zorath weapons were powerful, and the ship shuddered under the impact. But the humans knew they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Carter's voice was calm but urgent as she directed her crew, guiding them through the storm of fire from the Zorath fleet. The ship's hull groaned, but it held together, and the crew pushed on. They were a well-oiled machine, and Carter was the beating heart at the center of it all, her resolve unwavering. After hours of skirmishing, the Zorath fleet finally began to retreat. They were battered and confused, their warlords scrambling to regroup. The human ship had done what no one thought possible. It had turned the tide of battle, using tactics and ingenuity to outmaneuver the Zorath's overwhelming firepower. The Sovereign's wrath had emerged victorious, and for the first time in centuries, the galaxy saw the Zorath retreat, not because they were beaten, but because they had been outwitted. The news of this unexpected victory spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The Zorath, once thought invincible, had been forced to retreat by a single human warship. It was a moment of triumph, but it also marked the beginning of something much larger. For the first time in history, the Zorath's grip on the galaxy was threatened, and it had come from the most unlikely of sources: the humans. The news of the Sovereign's wrath's victory spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. Across occupied worlds, resistance movements grew bolder, emboldened by the unexpected triumph of a single human warship. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's oppressed species dared to believe they could defeat the Zorath. But as the Zorath learned of their humiliation, they quickly regrouped and turned their anger toward the humans, vowing to wipe the insolent threat from existence. General Gorek, furious at the failure of his fleet, issued an order for an all-out offensive. The Zorath were no longer simply defending their empire. They were retaliating with everything they had. They would strike at the Sovereign's wrath with overwhelming force, teaching the humans that no one defied the Zorath and survived. In response, Captain Carter and her crew prepared for what was sure to be the most dangerous challenge of their lives. As the Zorath warlords readied their fleets, Carter knew that the only way to survive this assault would be through deception, misdirection, and unpredictability. They would not win through sheer firepower. They would have to outsmart the Zorath. Once again, the first wave of the Zorath offensive came like a storm. Hundreds of Zorath ships, massive, terrifying vessels, descended upon the human warship, their weapons primed and ready to strike. The Sovereign's wrath was still outnumbered, but Carter had anticipated this. The human ship didn't fight head-on. Instead, it danced through the battlefield, darting between Zorath ships with unmatched agility. Carter had devised a plan to use the environment to her advantage. She had drawn the Zorath deep into an asteroid field that surrounded a nearby dead star. At first, the Zorath underestimated the threat, thinking that the human vessel would be easy prey in the hazardous field. But what they didn't anticipate was the Sovereign's wrath's ability to navigate the field with uncanny precision. The human warship moved like a shadow, using the rocks and debris as shields to block incoming fire, while picking off the Zoreth ships one by one. Every time the Zoreth thought they had cornered the human vessel, it slipped away, slipping through cracks in the debris, or diving into pockets of radiation, where the Zoreth's sensors were useless. Carter's tactics were unorthodox, even for the Zoreth. Instead of relying on brute force, the humans used their understanding of the terrain to manipulate the battlefield. The Zoreth's massive, cumbersome ships struggled to keep up. Their firepower was overwhelming, but their size made them slow and clumsy in the dense asteroid field. The Sovereign's wrath appeared to be everywhere at once, always out of reach, always slipping away at the last moment. General Gorak watched the chaos unfold on his command screen, his temper fraying. The Zoreth fleet had been humiliated once again, unable to land a single decisive blow on the human ship. His warlords demanded a different strategy, one that would not rely on the terrain. Gorak, frustrated but determined, ordered the deployment of the Zoreth's most powerful weapon, the Omega Cannon. It was a planet killer, capable of firing a beam so powerful that it could tear through the Sovereign's wrath in a single shot. But Carter was ready. She had anticipated the Zoreth's desperation. While the Zoreth fleet was still tangled in the asteroid field, the Sovereign's wrath used a daring tactic, drawing the Omega Cannon's fire toward a decoy signal. As the beam fired, it missed its intended target and instead struck the debris of a nearby asteroid, causing a chain reaction that knocked out several Zoreth ships in the process. The Zoreth warlords were again stunned. What had seemed like a surefire victory was slipping through their fingers. Carter's voice rang clear over the ship's intercom, her tone cold and calculating. "Prepare for the final strike. We're ending this now." The Sovereign's wrath emerged from the wreckage of the battlefield, weapons powered up and firing in perfect synchronization. Each strike was precision-guided, each shot hitting Zoreth ships in their most vulnerable points. The Omega Cannon, a symbol of Zoreth supremacy, was rendered useless. Gorak's forces were in retreat again, scattered and broken. The Zoreth could not understand how a race so young and seemingly weak could outthink and outmaneuver them at every turn. With their leadership in disarray, the Zoreth were left to lick their wounds, confused and demoralized. The humans had once again proven that they were not the helpless prey the Zoreth believed them to be. The galaxy was shifting. Resistance movements gained strength. Alliances were formed, and even the Zoreth's own subjects began to question their empire's power. And through it all, the Sovereign's wrath continued to sail through the stars, a symbol of hope and defiance in the face of tyranny. The humans had shown the galaxy that sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't sheer force, but the ability to think, to adapt, and to strike when least expected. The Sovereign's wrath was a constant thorn in the side of the Zoreth. What had begun as a single anomaly in their empire had become something far worse, an uprising. The humans had defied them twice now, not through brute force, but with cunning and innovation, and the Zoreth began to realize that this wasn't just a temporary threat. It was a signal of something much larger, a shifting tide in the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, doubt began to creep into the hearts of the Zoreth. General Gorak sat in the darkened command room aboard his flagship, his fists clenched on the armrests. His once unshakable confidence had been replaced by uncertainty. The Zoreth were the mightiest conquerors in the galaxy, yet they were being thwarted by a single human warship. The reports were troubling. Despite their overwhelming numbers and superior firepower, the Zoreth were losing precious ground. Resistance fleets, inspired by the success of the Sovereign's wrath, were now coordinating attacks from every corner of the galaxy. Gorak had to do something. His officers, proud, powerful beings who had once never known defeat, were growing increasingly restless. They had witnessed the Sovereign's wrath cripple one of their most powerful war fleets, watched as their ships were picked apart piece by piece, and felt the sting of humiliation. Now, the humans had made it their mission to cripple Zoreth supply lines, sabotage their refueling stations, and disrupt their reinforcements. The Zoreth were faltering, and for the first time in their long reign, They weren't sure how to win. Desperation led Gorak to issue an order unlike any he had given before. He called for a complete change in strategy. He would no longer rely solely on the Zoreth's traditional tactics of brute force. Instead, he would use the one thing the humans had never fully understood: fear. Gorak began deploying what were known as the Reapers, an elite division of Zoreth warriors, genetically engineered for psychological warfare. These warriors were notorious for their ability to manipulate and break the will of entire civilizations. The Reapers weren't just soldiers. They were walking nightmares, capable of entering the minds of their enemies and instilling terror that paralyzed them. Gorak believed that if fear could be weaponized, it would break the spirit of humanity and the resistance. While Gorak's new approach was unfolding, the Sovereign's wrath continued its relentless campaign. Captain Carter knew that this new strategy from the Zoreth would be their most dangerous yet. She wasn't naive enough to think the Zoreth would go down without a fight, and the Reapers were a real threat. But the humans had something the Zoreth could never understand: unity. While the Zoreth relied on fear to control their empire, humanity had learned to resist it, to turn it into a source of strength. Captain Carter gathered her crew. They were a mix of veterans, civilians, and refugees, all with one thing in common: a fierce determination to protect their homes. Her voice echoed through the comms as she addressed them. "We've been given the chance to do something no one thought possible. We're not just fighting for our survival. We're fighting for every race and species under the shadow of the Zoreth. We fight as one, and we'll make sure they never forget that." In response, the crew of the Sovereign's Wrath stood taller, their resolve firming. The Zoreth may have unleashed their most terrifying weapon, but they didn't understand the one thing that made humanity unique. They were fighters, not just survivors. Their strength wasn't just in their weapons or tactics. It was in their collective spirit, their shared will to protect the innocent and fight for freedom. As the Zoreth sent the Reapers into battle, the Sovereign's Wrath adopted new tactics. Carter relied on psychological warfare of her own, disrupting the communication systems of the Zoreth and scrambling their ability to coordinate with their Reapers. Using misinformation, feints, and false signals, Carter led the Zoreth into a series of traps, leading them to believe their enemies were everywhere when, in fact, they were just shadows in the dark. The Zoreth, once certain of their invincibility, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The Reapers, so accustomed to breaking their enemies' spirits, found themselves unable to understand the human resistance. Fear could not thrive in the face of unity. And as the Sovereign's Wrath emerged victorious yet again, the Zoreth began to understand something they hadn't before. The humans were not just an annoyance. They were a force to be reckoned with. For the first time, the Zoreth's mighty empire began to falter. And with every victory, the humans proved that their true power lay in their ability to fight not just for themselves, but for each other. The Zoreth's reign of fear was being slowly unraveled, and the humans, led by their small but unyielding warship, had set the wheels of change in motion. The victory of the Sovereign's Wrath had sent ripples through the galaxy. Resistance movements that had once been fractured and disjointed were now unified under a single cause. The Zoreth, once thought invincible, were beginning to show cracks. Their military might, though still vast, was no longer the overwhelming force it had once been. The tide of war had shifted, and the galaxy was slowly waking up to the possibility of rebellion. On the fringes of Zoreth-controlled space, a secret meeting was taking place. Representatives from various systems, once subjugated by the Zoreth, had come together in the hope that they could unite against their common enemy. Among them were former military officers, exiled leaders, and even members of species who had been enslaved for centuries. All of them had one thing in common. They were tired of living under the Zoreth's heel. One of the leaders at the table, a tall, imposing figure with blue skin and glowing amber eyes, addressed the group. "The Sovereign's Wrath has done what we once thought impossible. The Zoreth are not invincible. But we cannot fight this war in the shadows anymore. We need to stand together. We need to strike when the Zoreth least expect it. This leader, Commander Taura, had once been a high-ranking officer in the Zoreth military. She had escaped after witnessing the atrocities they had committed, and she knew their weaknesses better than anyone. The Zoreth are strong, yes, but they're also prideful. They believe they are the galaxy's rulers by birthright, and they will underestimate us at every turn. But if we move quickly, if we attack from all sides, we can catch them off guard. Her words rang with authority, and the room fell silent as the others absorbed her plan. For the first time, they saw a chance, an actual chance, to defeat the Zoreth, and they knew that the Sovereign's wrath had already proven the key to unlocking this opportunity. It wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol of resistance, of hope. Meanwhile, Captain Carter stood aboard the Sovereign's wrath, overseeing preparations for the next phase of their campaign. The human ship had become more than just a weapon. It was a rallying point for those who had lost everything to the Zoreth. Messages from across the galaxy came in daily, pleading for help, begging for the Sovereign's wrath to join their fight. Carter had always known the stakes were high, but now the pressure felt heavier than ever. She knew that if they were to truly defeat the Zoreth, they couldn't keep fighting small skirmishes. They needed to strike at the heart of the Empire itself. "It's time we made them feel our presence," she said quietly, staring out at the dark expanse of space. "We need to send a message they won't be able to ignore." Her strategy was simple: target Zoreth strongholds, key supply depots, and communication hubs. Take away their ability to coordinate, to refuel, to reinforce their forces. The Zoreth were a giant, but giants were slow. The humans, the resistance, they were nimble, able to strike fast and disappear before the enemy could react. Carter's crew had grown into a tight-knit family, each of them skilled in their respective fields. Commander Harris, the ship's tactical genius, was already poring over star maps, charting the best routes for the upcoming assault. Lieutenant Sori, a former scout, was preparing the ship's stealth systems, ensuring that they could slip past Zoreth defenses undetected. And Sergeant Cade, a former soldier from Earth, was working with the resistance forces to coordinate ground strikes on the planets they would soon attack. The first of these attacks came swiftly and decisively. The Sovereign's wrath and a fleet of resistance ships descended upon a Zoreth supply station hidden deep within a nebula. The attack was calculated and precise, designed to cripple their enemies without drawing attention to the humans' full capabilities. Within hours, the Zoreth found themselves scrambling to replace vital supplies, unable to maintain their military positions. The next strike was even more audacious. Carter led the Sovereign's wrath to a Zoreth-held colony on the edge of the galaxy, a planet rich with resources that the Zoreth used to fuel their war machine. The humans' plan was simple: destroy the planet's resource infrastructure, causing an economic collapse in the region. As the Sovereign's wrath dropped out of hyperspace and unleashed its devastating payload on the colony's main refinery, it became clear to the Zoreth that the humans were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were coming for them. In the aftermath of the attack, Commander Taura's message reached Captain Carter's comms. "We've seen your victories. The galaxy is watching. The rebellion is gathering strength. But we need your help to finish this. The Zoreth are close to breaking, but we must act quickly. The time to strike at their heart is now." Carter looked out the viewport of her ship, her resolve solidifying. The time for fear was over. The Zoreth would soon learn that the rebellion wasn't just a spark. It was a wildfire, and it was consuming everything in its path. Humanity's greatest strength was not just in their courage, but in their ability to unite others in the face of impossible odds. And the Zoreth would soon understand that their empire would fall, not because of sheer force, but because they had underestimated the one thing the humans and their allies had in abundance: hope. The galaxy was in turmoil, and the Zoreth could feel it. Once, their empire had stretched across the stars, unchallenged, an insurmountable force feared by all. But now, cracks had formed in the mighty edifice. A resistance, led by a human warship, had begun to unravel the carefully constructed web of Zoreth control. Each victory by the Sovereign's wrath felt like a ringing bell of defiance, echoing across the galaxy. The humans had become more than just a nuisance. They had become a rallying cry. General Gorek sat at the heart of his flagship, his mind racing. Reports flooded in from every corner of his empire. Resistance forces were gaining ground, supply lines were severed, and key strongholds were falling one by one. His once proud fleet was now shattered and retreating, and the galaxy that had been firmly under the Zoreth's boot was slipping from their grasp. And there, at the center of it all, was the human ship, the Sovereign's wrath. The constant thorn in his side, the symbol of everything that threatened to undo them. The Zoreth had always relied on their immense size, their overwhelming firepower, and their ability to crush any resistance with brutality. But the humans had proven that they could outthink them, outmaneuver them, and strike at their weakest points. Gorak's pride, the very thing that had carried him to his position, was now a dangerous liability. He had underestimated the humans, and now, for the first time in his long career, he felt doubt creeping in. On the Sovereign's wrath, Captain Carter was preparing for their final assault. She had seen the reports from the front lines. The resistance was swelling. The once scattered, fractured groups of rebels had united under a common banner, and the Zoreth were weakening. But Carter knew this wasn't the time to let up. The Zoreth still had their ultimate weapon, their flagship, the Dread Sovereign. It was the heart of their fleet, the most powerful warship in the galaxy, and it was currently on its way to engage the Sovereign's wrath in a final confrontation. But Carter wasn't afraid. She had seen the Zoreth at their strongest, and she knew how to break them. "We don't need to match their power. We need to match their resolve," she said, her voice steady but determined as she addressed her crew. "We'll lure them into a trap. The Dread Sovereign thinks they're coming for us, but we'll turn the tables. We're going to make sure they know who's in control of this war." The Sovereign's wrath had become more than just a warship. It was the beating heart of the rebellion. Every member of Carter's crew had been transformed by the fight, by the sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. And now, with the final battle looming, their unity and resourcefulness would be tested like never before. In the cold expanse of space, the Sovereign's wrath and the Dread Sovereign would soon meet. The Zoreth flagship, massive and imposing, was a juggernaut of firepower. But the Sovereign's wrath was faster, more agile, and infinitely more unpredictable. Captain Carter had studied the Dread Sovereign's design for weeks, analyzing every weakness, every flaw in its defenses. She knew that if they could get close enough, if they could outmaneuver the flagship's heavy weaponry, they could land a decisive blow. As the two ships neared each other in the black void, the tension was palpable. The Zoreth fleet closed in behind the Dread Sovereign, ready to unleash a storm of firepower. But Carter's strategy had already been set into motion. She had drawn the Zoreth fleet into a narrow, dangerous asteroid field, one where their size and numbers would be more of a disadvantage than an advantage. "We've got one shot at this," Carter said, her voice unwavering. "Stay tight. Move fast." With a precision that only the Sovereign's wrath could execute, the human warship darted into the asteroid field, weaving between massive rocks and debris, evading Zoreth fire as the Dread Sovereign and its fleet followed in pursuit. The Zoreth ships struggled to keep up, their sensors overwhelmed by the dense field of asteroids. But the Sovereign's wrath danced between the rocks, always just out of reach, a ghost in the dark. At the right moment, Carter issued the command. The Sovereign's wrath emerged from the field, close enough to the Dread Sovereign to strike. The Zoreth flagship tried to turn, to bring its massive weapons to bear, but it was too late. The human ship fired with precision, its missiles finding weak points in the Dread Sovereign's defenses. The first blast tore through its shields, the second struck its engines, and the third brought down its command center. In a matter of minutes, the Dread Sovereign was crippled, its once mighty hull now a lifeless wreck floating in space. The Zoreth fleet, disoriented and leaderless, began to retreat in confusion. The humans had done the impossible once again. Back on the Sovereign's wrath, Carter allowed herself a brief moment of relief. They had won. The Zorath's most powerful warship had fallen, and with it, the heart of their empire. The rebellion had struck the final blow, and for the first time, the Zorath were no longer the undisputed rulers of the galaxy. As the galaxy began to rebuild, as the once feared Zorath retreated into the shadows, the humans stood tall. They had shown that it wasn't size, firepower, or fear that led to victory, but resolve, unity, and the courage to fight when all seemed lost. And in the end, the galaxy had learned that humanity, against all odds, was a force to be reckoned with. The Sovereign's wrath hung in space, its systems powering down after the battle with the Dread Sovereign. The battlefield was eerily quiet now, with only the remnants of the Zorath fleet scattered across the stars. The victory had been overwhelming, but it came with a sense of finality. The Zorath Empire had been crushed, their once mighty fleet shattered, and their will broken. The humans, the resistance forces, and their allies had turned the tide of the war, and the galaxy had changed forever. Captain Carter stood in the command center of the Sovereign's wrath, her eyes fixed on the void outside. She allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, but there was no time for celebration. The victory was important, but the real work was just beginning. The galaxy, scared by centuries of Zorath oppression, was in need of healing, rebuilding, and unity. "Report," Carter said, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of exhaustion. Her officers, who had been by her side through every harrowing battle, quickly filled in the details. "Zorath resistance has collapsed," Commander Harris reported, his face lit by the glow of his console. "Most of their remaining fleets are in retreat or scattered. We've disabled their communications and supply lines across the Empire. Their infrastructure is in ruins. We've received messages of support from almost every system in the galaxy," Lieutenant Sori added. "It's clear now. People believe the Zorath are done. The rebellion's victory has galvanized every species that was subjugated." "We won the war," Sergeant Cade said, a small smile crossing his face. "But it's going to take time to free the people who've been left behind. The damage is done, and not every system is liberated yet. The rebuilding must start now." Carter nodded. "I know. We've won the battle. But now we need to help the galaxy find its footing again. The Zorath controlled so much for so long that we can't just leave the pieces to fall where they may. We'll need to establish order, work with local governments, and make sure the resources we've liberated aren't wasted." The room fell into a moment of contemplation. The war had been long and brutal, but it was over. Yet the true cost of the conflict was only just beginning to reveal itself. The galaxy would need leaders, visionaries who could steer it away from the darkness of Zorath rule and toward a brighter future. Carter had no illusions. The work ahead would be difficult, and there would be those who tried to exploit the chaos that followed the fall of an empire. But she also knew that the galaxy had learned something powerful through this fight. The galaxy was not made up of faceless, oppressed species any longer. It was a galaxy of survivors, of fighters, of beings who had shown that even the greatest of tyrants could be toppled. And now, they would show that they could build something greater in the ruins of Zorath oppression. "We won't be able to do this alone," Carter said, turning toward her officers. "The Zorath may be gone, but we need every species, every resistance fighter, every world to work together. It's not just about one ship or one crew. This victory is for all of us." "We'll spread the message," Commander Harris agreed. "Every colony, every star system will hear about this. The Zorath may have spread fear across the galaxy for centuries, but we've shown that hope, unity, and strength are the real weapons of the future." Carter turned to face the large view screen in the command center. The stars stretched out before them, vast and infinite. The Zorath's empire may have been built on fear, but the future, she knew, would be built on something far stronger: cooperation, resilience, and a determination never to let tyranny take root again. "The galaxy has changed," she said softly, almost to herself, "and it's up to all of us to make sure that change lasts." With the fall of the Dread Sovereign and the retreat of the last remnants of the Zoreth, the humans and their allies had created something new. It wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new era. An era where the people of the galaxy would no longer be subjects of an empire, but citizens of a shared future. A future where the fight for freedom would never be forgotten. And as the Sovereign's wrath set a course for the heart of the galaxy, to begin the difficult work of rebuilding, Captain Carter couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. They had shown the galaxy that no matter how powerful a force seemed, no matter how entrenched the enemy was, there was always a chance for the oppressed to rise. The Zoreth had spread fear across the stars. But now, it was humanity's turn to spread hope.